the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Brought to you by NYSHEX, helping you deliver through volatility.
Hi, everyone. You're listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, how are you doing?
I'm doing phenomenally. As you can see in the nice blue skies, I am in sunny southern Spain. Tomorrow I'll cross the border into the UK territory of Gibraltar, and 6 days from now, jumping on a ferry sailing to
That's
Africa.
awesome. Are you excited to finally kick off the Africa part of the journey? I know you've already been traveling for so long.
Absolutely, but I think this has been 2 months well spent getting into new routines, getting the van Sally really thoroughly tested before we take the ferry
Yeah,
down to
definitely a
Africa.
smart call. All right, let's get going, starting with NYFI rates as per usual. Let me get my screen share up here. So we've got quite a lot to go through today. Let's start off by talking about where the Asia to US West Coast, Asia US East Coast rates are and where they have been trending over the past 12 months.
Yeah, because as you also clearly showing here, rates went up here over spring and early summer. US West Coast then have flatlined for more than a month. We also see now US East Coast having flatlined for some 3-4 weeks. If we only look at the NYFI rates, we will conclude, okay, fine, that the market peaked and this is basically where we are now. There are a few interesting elements here. If you were to look at, for example, the SCFI quoted rates, I know we mentioned them before, they skyrocketed 3 weeks ago. And historically, if those quotes really do materialize into actual bookings and move cargo, you would see 2 to 3 weeks lag time and then will show up in the NYFI. It's very clear they are not for now. So it would seem we are getting into this element of what we've discussed before. There are some phantom DRIs. There was maybe a bit too much optimism in terms of how much rate increases through, and it's so far not manifesting itself in the average rates. But the other element, which I think is going to be interesting also for our listeners to follow through here this week, is there are some odd developments on the Transpacific when we look into the details.
Yeah, maybe let's take a look at that. So I'll pull up here the subtrades for Asia US West Coast. Can you walk us through what's happening here?
Yes. If we look at Asia US West Coast, one thing to comment, we've talked about that many times before, usually the Northeast Asia rates are volatile around the other ones. We still see that too a little bit. We also see all three sub-indices, and again, the sub-indices are, one is from Southeast Asia, the other one is from Northeast Asia, and the last one is from China and Taiwan. The really odd one here is all of them flatline, but in the last week, rates from Southeast Asia suddenly takes off. This doesn't even align with, again, I mentioned the SCFI rates before. SCFI are very specific. They are spot rates out of Shanghai. China to US West Coast here in the NYFI hasn't changed. What has changed here is Southeast Asia. So suddenly we see a massive departure, significant rate increases for cargo loaded in Southeast Asia, which is quite a departure from what we usually see.
Yeah, definitely.
But this is US West Coast Pacific. This is not even the wildest development of them all. We find that if we switch coasts and look at the US East Coast. If we look at the US East Coast rates here, what we see again is the flatlining I talked about, but Northeast Asia to US East Coast plummets almost 30% week on week. This is a massive, usually Northeast Asia to US East Coast, that would actually tend to be cargo that is destined for going through the Panama Canal. Because if you are in Northeast Asia, that means cargo comes from northern China, Japan, South Korea. If you want to go to US East Coast, the shortest route is actually through the Panama Canal. If you go from Southeast Asia and want to go to US East Coast, you would typically go the other way around, either via Africa or in normal times in the US. But this is even stranger because we're going to talk more about Panama Canal and the looming problems with water. Some of the carriers have announced surcharges on the Panama Canal cargo already because of this, yet we see rates there plummet. So again, a relatively odd development.
It seemingly doesn't make sense.
It doesn't. And when I was preparing for our podcast here, I thought, is this some of the largest declines we've ever seen? So if we expand the view here to look not just at the last 12 months, but look at the NYFI all the time it has actually been in existence and recording, we find that, no, this is actually not extreme. We have seen these kinds of drops before. Not often, but we have. We have 4 different occasions here where we saw spikes and then these sudden drops. And they were always precursors for much larger drops than what we see now. This is not to say it's 100% guarantee just because we see a massive weekly drop on Northeast Asia to US East Coast rates that this will happen for sure. But what I'm saying is the last 4 times we saw it, it most certainly was a harbinger of the end of a high rate regime.
Interesting.
And that brings us, you can say brings us back to a topic we've been talking about also for several weeks, this whole, let's call it uneasiness or uncertainty in the market. The market seemed unsettled. Maybe it's a good reason to also just revisit that first for US West Coast and US East Coast, because the market being unsettled, what we talked about before, is to some degree that is reflected in the spread in the market. Who pays the least, who pays the most? I think if we narrow down to, again, just looking at the last 12 months, we get a clearer picture. This is Asia, US West Coast, which we have seen before. The market tended to be unsettled when you reached the height of the peak. Then it narrowed down as the peak flattened out. And then it has expanded again over the last couple of weeks. The level of unsettledness or uncertainty in the Pacific market to the West Coast is now as extreme as it was when we reached the apex of the rate increases more than a month ago. So a great deal of uncertainty. But this is actually not the largest degree of uncertainty. This becomes even more pronounced if we look at the Asia to US East Coast trade. Because if we look at the Asia to US East Coast trade, this almost looks like the endpoint of a trumpet. You see this extreme widening. Suddenly we get to a spread on Asia US West Coast, which is almost $4,000 per FFE. This is a crazy level of uncertainty in a market where rates are hovering around the $7,000 or so dollar mark. So having a $4,000 difference between the ones who pay the lowest and the most really is quite extreme. This is ballooned. So on both the coasts of the Transpacific trade, we are looking at a market that is highly unsettled, to put it mildly. And if we combine it with this now disparity between the paid rates and the quoted rates we see in, for example, the SDFI, it really shows a market that is in a little bit of a disarray in terms of what is going to happen next.
I'm such a fan of these rate spread charts. I think it's a really interesting way to dissect how the rates are actually playing out. If you have just your one average rate, like it tells a story, but it's not really giving you the whole picture. But really this week especially, I think we're seeing some dramatic differences between the top and the bottom in terms of price spread. So this week is particularly interesting, I think.
I think you've phrased that quite well. The average is only one story. It's like this old joke I think everybody knows. My head is in the oven, my feet is in the freezer, so on average, I'm okay. And what these graphs helps is actually paint the underlying picture that you might not be okay at all.
All right, let's also talk a little bit about futures, specifically for Asia, North Europe. Let me get that pulled up here.
Yes.
Yeah, so what are we seeing here?
What we're seeing here is basically a continued development in line with what we have talked about. We are past the apex, we're past the summer peak of the market. Rates are coming down. They're not coming down as rapidly as the market participants expected. What we're seeing here is an increase in the future rate levels going forward. Of course, the future still expect rates to continue to go down. It would be very strange if they didn't, but at least at a higher level. So the peak is slowly abating, but not an outright crash. I think we talked about that before. This is not a crash, it is an abatement, but now it's going even slower than what the market participants actually anticipated. We now also see an increased expectation of, I wouldn't call it a peak, but at least elevated rates in connection with Chinese New Year in early 2020.
Gotcha, okay. Awesome. All right, anything else you wanted to add with the NYFI rates here?
No, maybe I just want to add one comment now that we're also looking at the Asia-Europe trade here, because as hopefully many of our listeners are well aware of, you have what's called Golden Week in the first week of October in China. This is where everybody goes on vacation. And that always spells the end even of this abatement of the peak. And we're now seeing carriers plan for it. We have seen Gemini announce it was 3 or 4 blank sailings on Asia-Europe right around that week. We now saw MSC today also announce 4 blank sailings, all of these on the Asia-Europe trade, which is perfectly normal and in line with, yes, they are definitely expecting whatever abatement we have demand will drop seasonally once we get into that the Golden Week, and capacity needs to be adjusted and taken out of the market. And that's what they're communicating already. If anything, this time they're communicating it a month ahead of time. In past years, it's been fairly normal. This was only communicated, say, 2 to 3 weeks prior. So this at least allows shippers to plan around these blank
Yeah,
sailings.
and maybe for some of the newer listeners, it might be a good idea to talk through what generally happens right before Golden Week and then during Golden Week. You mentioned that everyone goes on vacation in Asia. Do you tend to see a rate spike right before because everyone's trying to get cargo loaded and out of Asia on its way? What normally happens? What could be expected?
Yeah, basically, it's a week-long vacation in China, which means a lot of the factories close down. So there's not a lot produced, which of course then also translates into there's a lot less cargo that needs to be moved. This comes on top of another cyclicality that's important, and that's basically the holiday sales. So not just at Christmas, but also in the months leading up to Christmas in Europe, in North America, in South America. And if you want to get these goods on your shelves, you need to send them months prior. And furthermore, you definitely don't want to send them during Golden Week because then you hit a snag because of the holidays in China. So seasonally, the combination of the high seasonal sales at the end of the year combined with Golden Week means that traditionally you would see the peak season of most cargo being moved and therefore also the highest rates typically reach an apex around the beginning of August. What we have seen in the last couple of years is this apex have moved back. So it's now actually happened a month or a bit more a month earlier on Asia, Europe, especially driven by the lengthy travel times around Africa due to the Red Sea crisis. In the US, this has been a little bit more erratic and has more been influenced by the vagaries of the trade war between especially US and China.
Awesome. Great context. Thank you for walking us through that. All right, let's switch gears a little bit. We talked about the Panama Canal in a lot of the recent episodes. Are there any new updates that we should share with listeners today?
There was a new advisory coming out from the Panama Canal authorities. They are basically also, that's my read on it, quite concerned this will do to water levels. In the latest one, they're mentioning that from May to August, so this is not in the future, this has already happened. The rain inflow into Lake Gatun, which is the important lake for driving the canal, the rain that they have received is 34% lower than normal. And this is basically before El Nino came into full effect. We're only seeing El Nino ramp up now. So we're going to have significant problems. We have seen them in the past couple of months make a few small restrictions in terms of changing what the draft is. Usually it's 50-foot draft. That's been gradually lowered now all the way down to 47.5. But in the newest one, they're actually now also reducing the number of daily transits being allowed already here from September. So it's not that they couldn't do the full transits now in September, they could, but that would mean draining Lake Gatun already now. So this is clearly a way to try to conserve water. We have not seen them act this proactively before, which on one hand is good because they are being proactive about it. On the other hand, it's also an extremely strong signal just how concerned they are in terms of what restrictions we might face in the Panama Canal when we then get into the new year. And maybe drawing a line back up to what we talked about before, this could result in also a challenge because the next peak season coming up on the Pacific is, of course, the usual one leading up to Chinese New Year. So that's where we would see a lot of volume move, likely beginning here in December. This might coincide with the beginning of severe restrictions in the Panama Canal. So I mentioned it in the podcast last week. I'm going to mention it again. If you're a shipper and your supply chain depends on usage of the Panama Canal, you need to think through this because at best you might face higher costs, but your supply chain will still operate. At worst, second worst, you might have to see your cargo go on a ship the other way around Africa through Suez, which will lengthen it. Even worse, you might look at alternative moving cargo over land. But you will not be the only one doing this, and there will not be enough space for everyone. So everyone that depends on using the Panama Canal need to work through their contingency plans and have them ready to go.
We've been talking about the forecasts that we've been getting from the weather professionals that understand how all this works, but getting the hard data of the rain inflow being a third lower than what you normally see this time of year. That's a hard fact. Like, this is actually happening. We should take it very seriously because, like you were mentioning, in a couple months, you could have some pretty drastic measures that you may have to be taking. And if that doesn't happen, great. At least you are prepared for it and you're not caught off guard.
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz and Red Sea. So what are the latest happenings there?
Yeah, you can say on the Red Sea, not really a lot of news compared to when we talked about it the last time. Carriers seem to be slowly normalizing. At least CMA continues to do what they have been doing. Gemini have 2 services going through. Maersk also have 2 of their own services, Mekl and their West Africa 6 service that goes from West Africa into the Middle East. They are basically going through. We have seen reports that MSC have sent a total of 7 ships so far through. So this is this gradual normalization of the Red Sea. Undisputably good news, no matter how you slice and dice it. In the Strait of Hormuz, I was about to say there are no news. In reality, there are. When it comes to container ships sailing through, the strait is still shut. That's basically it. The only news here is that we had messages from the U.S. government over the last 24 hours that they wanted to create at least what some were calling an economic D-Day. We still don't have any details whatsoever. That was promised to come here Monday morning, Washington time, when we started to record this podcast, which is actually Monday morning, Washington time. There had been no details so far. So the only thing we know are what came out in headline form from the U.S. government, that they wanted to completely cut off all countries that were doing any kind of business with Iran.
Okay.
That's all we know. What we also know is China is doing business with Iran. So ask yourself the following: if U.S. is serious about this, that means cutting off China. If we look at the way China acts over the last 18 months, it is a given that then China would retaliate in some way, shape, or form. We have no idea what the U.S. government then has planned in detail. So let's stay tuned and watch what actually will transpire here. If they mean what they say, this is going to lead to a supply chain hiccup that is much, much larger than anything the Hormuz crisis itself can throw at us.
Maybe let's switch gears and talk a little bit about Canada. So there's been some happenings between the U.S. and Canada in terms of trade and tariffs. Can you give us a quick overview of what's been going on there?
Yeah. U.S. slapped a lot of tariffs on Canada. That was part of the whole trade war U.S. started last year. It has been on and off for a while. Then for a period, some of these tariffs, 50% tariffs on quite a number of Canadian goods, have been on pause while the U.S. and Canada were trying to come to a new trade deal and trade agreement. The U.S. government, or rather Trump himself, announced last week that the deadline was being postponed 3 days for the 50% tariffs because the deal was imminent. When 3 days were up, then negotiations broke down. The Canadians went home. So now we have 50% tariff on Canadian goods coming into the U.S. on a whole variety of goods. We also know that the Canadian Prime Minister have said that likely from September 8th, they will then retaliate in kind. And it seems that this break-off definitely didn't happen in good faith from either side. So whenever this will end is an open-ended question. It's one more in this very, very long string of volatile events we have seen unfold with the U.S. trade wars ever since April last year.
Definitely. All right. Thank you for the update. Let's also talk about the Northern Sea route. So we've mentioned this a little bit, but can you talk about the latest news that we've seen out of that?
Yeah, the week we just went through saw the vessel Dubai Tower departing China. It's operated by Sea Legend. They're the ones who have announced they're going to start irregular service, regular here actually. Whether you want to call that regular or not, I think it's a matter of taste, depending on how you want to choose to see it. It has received a lot of headlines. If you look at the numbers of it, the 8 vessels in total have a capacity between 15 and 20,000 TEU. So if they fill them completely, that will mean if you only look at these 2 months where they're actually sailing, that will give them a market share of 0.4% of the total Asia-Europe market. That's if they fill them. The question is whether they fill them, because another vessel that's departing now is a vessel run by Panstar out of South Korea as a trial shipment. This is a 2,700 TEU ship, but data from the Ministry of Ocean and Fisheries in Korea themselves have said it's only sailing with 800 and something TEU on board. So it's basically only 30% utilized for this trade across the Northern Sea route. The long and short here being, Can you sail that way? Yes, you can. We saw 15 ships do it last year. There were 11 ships doing it in 2024. But there is still a long way to go before this ever becomes anything that moves a meaningful part of the market. Again, to put things in context, if sea legend shipping is successful and move 15 to 20,000 TEU, for comparison, last year there were more than 300,000 TEU moved on the Trans-Siberian Rail Link, which, by the way, is still faster than the Northern Sea Route, and you don't risk your vessel being delayed due to ice. So Northern Sea Route is real. It does exist, but it seems quite overhyped in terms of its actual.
I have a couple questions for you on this. So, one, do you have any idea what the cost of using the service is?
Unfortunately, I don't. You can say I should have looked more into the cost and be prepared for that question, but off the top of my head, no, I actually don't. I would go out on a limb and venture the guess. I don't think those costs are any lower because these have been operated with vessels that are quite small compared to the ones that go on the main Asia-Europe route, which means if you have a 2, 3, 4,000 TEU ship and you're competing with a 24,000 TEU ship, your slot cost is not going to look great, to put it mildly. The argument then typically is then you don't have to pay for a Suez Canal or in the current time sail around Africa. And that is true, but you do have to pay for the standby assistance of the Russian nuclear-powered icebreakers. So that adds to your cost in any case. If you are being even halfway prudent about what you're doing, you also need an ice class vessel, which is a more expensive vessel than what you need in warmer waters. So I would actually be surprised if the slot cost or the unit cost on the Northern Sea route is competitive compared to the big ships.
Yeah. And are the time savings in terms of like days that you would save using this route significant enough to consider that? Maybe for some folks it is.
That depends. If all things pan out and if you're really lucky and you hit it when it is ice-free, and again, be clear here, last year it was only 2 weeks where the Northern Sea route was ice-free, 2 weeks. So if you hit the real sweet spot, you can make a transit in 20, 21 days. So clearly faster than your typical, say, 40, 45 days or more to go in the other direction. You can also book on the rail link and get even shorter transit times like that. It can also take a lot longer. We had the Chinese new shipping earlier here in the 2026 season. They sailed a ship from China to Murmansk. So also a Northern Sea route ship. That took 40 days, and that didn't even go all the way down to Northern Europe. So if you're unlucky with your ice conditions, you could be delayed for weeks. You simply don't know. So the 20-21 days, great if all things pan out. But if the ice doesn't cooperate, you can double that.
So definitely still in a proof of concept type of phase here. Really interesting stuff. Thanks for sharing that with us. The last topic that we had today is to touch on the FMC's position on the net zero framework. Give a super brief reminder for those listeners that don't know what net zero framework is, and tell us a little bit about what's going on right now.
Yeah. The very brief recap is the net zero framework is basically the agreement they're trying to make in the International Maritime Organization so the shipping becomes carbon neutral by 2050. That's the long and short of it. And also, simplifying extremely here, but basically it is putting a tax on fossil fuels in order to drive this development. That is the long and short of it. This was almost agreed. Then when it was supposed to be formally approved here in the beginning of 2026, actually a year ago, it was postponed. Then it was taken up again here in the beginning of 2026. But the US was very much against this concept to the degree where at one point the US was actually telling various countries, if you do agree to this, we might penalize you on, for example, your ship registries. So this can was kicked down the road. In November, there will be a new meeting. The interesting new development here is the messages that came from Laura DiBella, which is the chairman of the Federal Maritime Commission in the US. I think the interesting thing is it doesn't come out outright and say just kill the net zero framework, because that has been the position since at least the Trump administration came in. It is more down the path. We could potentially see this happen, but it requires that you allow the use of liquid natural gas, or LNG, as well as bioenergy. You could, of course, say the positive part is that they're not just outright dead against it, but let's also remember LNG is a fossil fuel. It emits less than our traditional fossil fuels, but LNG is still a fossil fuel, so of course will not lead to net zero. So how this will be received and what that means for the negotiations in November remains to be seen. You can say purely my own view on this, and then people can take it for what they want. When the net zero framework was postponed last November for a year to renegotiate, my view is that effectively means it is dead. What I expect to see happen in November, there will indeed be a net zero framework agreement made, but it will be a changed agreement that is so watered out so that the original intention that it should be enough to actually drive decarbonization by 2050 will no longer be feasible. That way, there will be a political victory for a lot of stakeholders. They can say we do have a net zero framework, but the original intention of a full decarbonization by 2050 is likely going to go out the window.
Yeah. When the decarbonization initiative was passed, were people pretty optimistic, yes, we can make this happen? Or was it still, this is definitely a stretch goal for the industry?
That very much depends on who you talk to. There were clear proponents that said this absolutely can be done. If we want to do it, there will be a price to be paid. But if we're willing to pay that price, then yes, it can be done. And of course, then you also had detractors saying, absolutely not, the time scale is too short, nobody want to pay for it. So where we had landed there, basically back at the end of 2025, was everybody thought there was enough of a majority in IMO to formally push this through, but that's what then fell through.
Gotcha.
And didn't happen.
It'll be interesting to see what happens as we get closer to November. All right, Lars, anything else you want to share today? I know we've had a pretty jam-packed episode.
Yeah, I think this would be enough to, I wouldn't say cause a headache with our listeners, but at least say, fine, this is it. Go relax in a comfortable chair, drink a nice cup of coffee, tea, water, whatever you have there.
Maybe go the Lars route and sit outside under some blue skies.
Definitely. One comment I would like to make here towards the end, again, just to make sure everybody is aware there's nothing hidden in this. This is, of course, a podcast sponsored by NYSEX. We talk about the NYFI index. And what I just would like people to know is I am also a very small investor in NYSEX. I believe every piece of analysis I give out there is as objective as I can make it be. If people see it differently, because when I say small, I'm talking less than a percentage. It's not that I have any influence on the company, but I think it's just important to be honest and open about what are people's interests out there.
Totally. All right. Thanks everyone for tuning in today. We'll be back next week for another episode. If you haven't already subscribed, we're on Apple Music, Spotify, and YouTube. And until then, I hope everyone has an awesome week. Bye, y'all.
Thanks for listening to the Supply Chain Secrets podcast, presented by NYSEX. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app.